Okay, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. In this episode, I'm tackling an interesting question from Quora. Is it true that each generation is condemned to making the mistakes of the past? So it's one of those questions that sounds simple, but the more you think about it, the more complicated it becomes. There's an old saying from philosopher George Santayana: those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. So the underlying idea has become part of our cultural vocabulary. We hear it whenever societies face economic crises, political turmoil, or some international conflict. But is history really like a loop? Are we trapped in some endless cycle of repeating the same errors? So I don't think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's no either. And I think it's more interesting than that. So that's because, quite simply, no generation starts with with a blank slate. Every generation kind of inherits the past. We inherit institutions, technologies, customs, political systems, scientific knowledge, moral values, and of course, the consequences of previous generations and their successes and failures. And as the philosopher Rene Descartes famously wrote, if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life doubt everything as far as possible. So that doesn't mean rejecting everything our ancestors believed. It means being willing to examine inherited assumptions rather than accepting them automatically. So imagine that. And each generation has to ask, what did previous generations get right? So, I'm not saying everything that they did was wrong. That would be about as foolish as believing they did everything right? What did they misunderstand? And what are we overlooking today? So, people often say that history repeats itself, but a more accurate way to describe it is that history rhymes, to paraphrase Mark Twain. The details change, the technology changes, cultures change, but human nature changes very slowly. We have this phenomenon of fear, we've got greed, pride, tribal loyalty, overconfidence. These have been constants throughout recorded history. And modern neuroscience and evolutionary psychology suggest something similar. Our brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, while civilization has transformed dramatically in only a few thousand. There's a plausible idea that modern humans still possess what could be likened to a Stone Age mind, brains adapted for ancient environments, trying to deal with a world of smartphones, artificial intelligence, global finance, and social media. So, in a way, you could almost say that we've outdone ourselves. We've sort of gotten too big for our britches. Would be another cute way of putting it. And that mismatch explains why familiar patterns keep appearing: financial bubbles, political polarization, or whatever you want to call the madness that's going on in the world, overconfidence in our military, scapegoating. Each generation believes its circumstances are unique, but you know, you can say that in many ways they are. But beneath those differences, human psychology remains remarkably familiar. And what about learning from failure? If history only repeated itself, civilization wouldn't have progressed at all. I know sometimes it seems like we take a few steps forward and then a bunch of steps back, but it's not quite like that. It's a little bit more complicated. The fact that we have made extraordinary advances proves that, we're not completely repeating history. We have in the past basically eradicated certain diseases through vaccination. Now, of course, there are anti vaxxers out there, and we're seeing the resurgence of certain diseases and certain problems. And we've expanded civil rights, and of course, there are some people who want to retract civil rights again. We've improved workplace safety, but of course, there are some interests out there that do not want workplace safety measures to be enforced. And we've developed scientific knowledge that previous generations could scarcely imagine. But of course, there are people out there who don't want us to have a lot of scientific knowledge that would restrict certain policies and certain ideologies. We've built technologies that would have looked like magic only a century ago. And these achievements happened precisely because people have studied past failures and decided to do better. Knowledge accumulates and experience, it makes a difference. And every mistake creates what we might call a larger mistake space, a growing map of ideas, strategies, and assumptions that have already been tested, so future generations don't have to begin from zero. If they're willing to learn, they begin several steps ahead, at least hypothetically. And then you got to get into that question, why do mistakes still return? So, if knowledge accumulates, why do familiar mistakes keep coming back? Well, because every generation faces some new circumstances. Old lessons don't always appear relevant, and people convince themselves this time is different. The economy, maybe that has changed. Technology has changed, politics have changed, propaganda convinces people that we're in a uniquely enlightened era, so we can do some twisted things in the world and it'll turn out differently this time. And surely the old rules no longer apply, according to certain people who don't want us to learn from the past. And sometimes maybe they're right that certain old rules no longer apply, but a lot of the time they are not right. And that's why history rarely repeats itself exactly. Instead, familiar behaviors emerge in unfamiliar settings. The tools evolve, human instincts remain surprisingly consistent, but over time, ignorance is also something that can accrue. It's not like we just have innovations through knowledge, we have some innovations of ignorance as well. So, the ability to just not care about what the facts will say, and, the insistence that my truth is the only one that matters, and there's another challenge. History is not just remembered, it's interpreted. And two thoughtful people can study exactly the same historical event and arrive at completely opposite conclusions. This is sometimes called the Rashomon effect. Uh, and I guess the idea is that different observers can honestly experience and interpret the same event in some dramatically different ways. So ask 10 historians why an empire collapsed. You may receive 10 different answers. Ask why a war began, why an economy failed, why a revolution succeeded. You'll often find disagreement over what the actual mistake even was. If people can't agree on the lesson, it's difficult for society to know which lesson should guide the future in the first place. And it's almost like every generation gets its own exam. Perhaps the best metaphor is precisely that. Every generation gets its own exam, but many of the questions are recycled. The wording changes, the context, and yes, the technology as well. So, like right now, we've got more advanced technology than in the past, and that complicates things. So, the underlying decision, despite all of these changes, remains remarkably familiar. Will fear overcome reason? Will pride defeat humility? Will short term gains outweigh long term consequences? Will we recognize warning signs before they become crises? Every generation answers these questions for itself. And you've got the old phenomenon, which I've talked about recently on this very podcast and a few other episodes, the conflict of tradition versus change. That's another important balance. Avoiding past mistakes does not mean preserving everything from the past. Not every tradition deserves to survive simply because it's old. Some traditions actually promote justice, others preserve communities, and some encourage responsibility and mutual respect. And those deserve careful preservation. Others, on the other hand, perpetuate unnecessary harm and continue long after their original purpose has even disappeared. Those deserve thoughtful reconsideration and, in some cases, basically abolition. I guess one of the funny things about being supposedly a radical on the left or whatever, is this image of a leftist who just wants to abolish everything. And sure enough, sometimes some things do deserve to be abolished indeed. So it's kind of a matter of choosing your own battles, like which things are actually deserving of more um, attention when it comes to the idea that we got to get rid of this, because frankly not everything is as bad as everything else in the pile of bad things, you know and I think sometimes people lose sight of that. They get a little distracted, and they they forget that you have to spend time doing one thing at a time a lot of the time. Like, you can try to split your focus, and sure enough we do have that ability to some extent, but really some things deserve a higher priority. And the goal is not tradition for tradition's sake, of course. That's a pretty ridiculous premise. It's no more sensible than just saying that, oh, we got to get rid of all traditions. We can't change simply because we can't change simply because something is new. That's not good either. Real progress comes from balancing continuity with reform, keeping what has value, improving what experience and evidence show can be made better. So today, technological, scientific, and social change happens faster than at presumably any point in human history. We're really at a point where we could make progress, but that doesn't seem like it's necessarily the way we're headed. And because we're able to make progress as a result of that, traditions are increasingly evaluated based on whether they still serve a useful purpose rather than simply because they've always existed, as the argument goes. Many assumptions that once seemed unquestionable have been re examined, while others have proven surprisingly resilient. And the challenge is knowing which is which. So, are we condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past? I would say no, not exactly, but neither are we guaranteed to avoid them. History offers us guidance and not certainty. Avoiding old mistakes requires some degree of humility and an ability to question the world that immediately surrounds you. Not just challenging other cultures, but actually having a little bit of backbone to challenge your own culture, you know, what environment you're surrounded by. We also need historical knowledge and intellectual honesty, and perhaps most importantly, the willingness to admit that previous generations may have learned some hard earned lessons worth preserving as well. We should remain open to improving what they left behind. If we really want to honor your ancestors, then improve upon the things that they, left us. The healthiest societies are not those that just worship the past, nor are they those that mindlessly discard it. They're the ones that study it carefully, question it honestly, preserve what works, and improve what does not. And that's the real lesson history keeps trying to teach us, whether we adhere to it or not. It's not that we're doomed to repeat it, but that every generation has another chance to get the answers a little more right than the one before. So, on that note, thanks for listening, and feel free to like and subscribe and all that crap. And I'll see you next time. Have a good one.